why do we believe that he was not speaking hyperbolically about the Eucharist at the Last Supper?
So to get to your question specifically in brief, Sam, it is a legitimate question to ask. First of all, I just want to affirm for you, because if all we had was Jesus taking bread and saying, "This is my body," a natural conclusion would be, well, he's just speaking metaphorically here, right? He's not really speaking literally, if that's all we had. So I'm sympathetic with our Protestant brothers and sisters who look at that and say, yeah, he's speaking symbolically. Because, you know, if I take something off of the table and I say, here, this represents David, and this bottle of ketchup over here represents Goliath, right? You're going to immediately know that I'm speaking metaphorically. Or if I have a picture of my wife, I say, this is my wife. Well, it's not my actual wife. It's a metaphor of it's a representation of my wife. However, Sam, the Last Supper is not all we have. We have to look at the Last Supper in light of where Jesus first promises to give us his flesh and his blood in John chapter 6 in his Bread of Life discourse in the synagogue in Capernaum. John chapter 6 verses 53 through 66, 67 is sort of the whole context there. But what we see there, Sam, is first of all that Jesus teaches us that the bread he will give, which he identifies as his flesh, which we know he fulfills at the Last Supper, is paralleled with and compared to the bread that was given from heaven in the Old Testament. Your fathers ate the bread from heaven and they died. The bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. Okay? Now, Sam, notice that that bread from heaven in the Old Testament was miraculous bread, right? It would appear in the morning. It would disappear in the evening. It would only remain on for enough for the Sabbath. Prior to the Sabbath, any day outside of the Sabbath, if the Israelites kept any remaining manna, it would breed worms, right, and become foul. And it ceased to exist once they entered the Promised Land. This was miraculous, supernatural stuff going on. And Jesus is using that as the parallel for the bread that he's going to give, which he fulfills and gives us at the Last Supper. So at least, Sam, we know at the Last Supper what he's doing is something supernatural. He is not giving us he's not giving us just bread, because if he were, then the new manna, the Eucharist, would be inferior to the old manna, which is supernatural. So there's something supernatural going on at the Last Supper, which precludes the idea that the bread merely symbolizes his body and blood. Something miraculous is happening here. It's supernatural in nature. So what is the supernatural nature of that which he's doing at the Last Supper? Well, he tells us it's his body, it's his blood. The supernatural context, Sam, allows for us to plausibly conclude that it is his body and his blood, that he's performing a miracle in the sense of changing bread and wine into his body and blood. So that's the first point. And then, Sam, we go back to the John chapter 6. Whenever Jesus says that the bread I will give is my flesh to eat, the Jews were told by John in verse 53, quarrel among themselves. How can this man give us his flesh to eat? They are having difficulty with the teaching. And rather than Jesus correcting or clarifying their literal thoughts, Sam, he affirms it 6 times. Unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life within you. And then 5 more times subsequent to that, he affirms their thought processes that this man is telling us to eat his flesh. This is crazy. Rather than Jesus correcting, he affirms. And then, Sam, in verse 60 through 61, his disciples even say, this is a hard teaching, who can accept it? If Jesus were speaking hyperbolically, Sam, and he was using the language of eating flesh and drinking blood only in a metaphorical sense, well, then his disciples would not have had a hard time with that. That is to say, if Jesus meant by those words, you just got to believe in me, because his disciples already believed in him. To think that the language of eating flesh and drinking his blood meant you just have to believe in Jesus would not have been a hard teaching for his disciples, who already believed in him, to accept. But his disciples do have a hard time accepting, so they're not thinking he's speaking metaphorically here, as if we just got to believe in him. And rather than Jesus clarifying the disciples' thoughts, once again, he affirms their thoughts. How so? by letting them walk away when they walk away on account of the difficulty in accepting the teaching to eat his flesh and drink his blood. And so it's the whole context of the Bread of Life discourse, Sam, that leads us to conclude that Jesus, when he spoke of eating his flesh and drinking his blood, which he would fulfill and give us at the Last Supper, he was not speaking metaphorically, but he was speaking literally. And so whenever we come to the Last Supper, this is my body, this is my blood, we read it in light of what he taught in John 6, and that leads us to the conclusion that at the Last Supper, within this miraculous supernatural context, Jesus is giving us his body and blood under the appearance of bread and wine. And that's what the Catholic Church has been teaching for the past 2,000 years.